Dust shimmered over the old Miller farm as another pale, blazing sun climbed the sky. At the far edge of a wilting soybean field, folks passing by slowed their trucks or horses to stare at the same odd sight. A boy, no more than 15, laying flat on his back beneath the one scrap of shade left, a gnarled cottonwood that clung to a patch of stubborn green. Eyes closed, hands behind his head or tracing patterns in the clover, he spent hours lost in the hum of bees and the slow crawl of clouds. Gossips at the general store shook their heads. "He's no good for farm work, that one," they'd murmur, wasting summer just napping in the field. His father muttered at supper, his mother sighed in quiet worry. All summer, while sweat poured from every adult and machine in the valley, the boy kept returning to the same grassy spot. No one, friends, neighbors, even his own family could guess why. What could a lazy boy possibly learn by lying so still, day after day, while a drought threatened to destroy everything around him? The town of Marsh Hollow had always measured worth in sweat, the kind that darkens a work shirt and leaves hands stained long after sundown. The Miller family was no exception. Generations had plowed these fields, built barns that leaned into the prairie wind, and stacked hay by hand all through childhood and old age. The boy, Tom, was born with the same sturdy build as his father and grandfather, but his spirit took after his grandmother, a woman who could name every bird by song and whose favorite chore was simply sitting on the porch to watch the sky change colors. Tom's parents prized honest toil. He helped with chores for years, milking before dawn, shoveling ditch mud, picking rocks, though he moved at his own slow, careful pace. He noticed how bees searched out wildflowers along the fence row, how ants built bridges when rain threatened their nest, and how fox kits always dug for cooler earth at high noon. His schoolmates would tease, "Tom just stares at the grass growing." But he was content with that, scribbling questions in a battered notebook, and counting patterns only he seemed to see. While others pushed forward, Tom looked for what lay beneath. Convinced that the land itself was telling a secret story, one most folks were just in too much of a hurry to hear. By midsummer, the drought sharpened everything. Parched ground split open, beans shriveled on their stems, and even the oldest maples dropped leaves months too soon. Wells dropped lower every week, and Mr. Miller grumbled with neighbors at the hardware store about whose corn had curled first. Day after day, the fields grew quieter as insects vanished, birds moved to wetter ground, and animals that usually stayed hidden began searching for water in broad daylight. Most folks saw only the browning tops, pumping what they could from dwindling ponds and praying for rain that never came. But Tom, stretched out close to the cracked soil, noticed what others missed. Grasshoppers gathered where a few blades stayed greenest, faint lines of damp earth snaked from the base of a hill, tracing hidden veins underground. Ants carried eggs down instead of out. Sun-warmed wind streaks shifted with odd rhythms across the beans. He jotted these details in his notebook, marking places that felt cooler, watching moths and field mice migrate toward one silent corner. While grown-ups cursed heaven and blamed fate, Tom's slow, steady observation mapped a puzzle no one else bothered to see, a secret landscape alive beneath the struggle above. The tougher the season grew, the more Tom's habit frustrated everyone around him. His father barked reminders that real work needed doing, that lying in dirt wouldn't pay the feed bill. His mother's voice turned sharper, chores hurriedly assigned before she left for town. Even neighbors began to frown when they saw Tom under the cottonwood as the sun burned overhead. "Every hand is needed," they'd scold, "not just 10 toes and a head in the clouds." Tom tried to blend in for a while, forcing himself to pick stones and haul water with the others, but he found his mind wandering back to subtle shadows and odd insect trails. After supper, he'd quietly sneak back to his patch, shoulders slumped with the weight of loneliness, notebook resting on his knees. Disappointment echoed in his parents' silence, but Tom wrote anyway, morning dew patterns, root clusters, stray fox tracks, filling his pages with a patience mistaken for idleness, but driven by something deeper. Even when teased or ignored, he kept watching. Years before, Tom had spent long summer afternoons with old Mr. Hastings, a neighbor whose garden flourished even in the worst seasons. With a slow shuffle and a battered straw hat, Hastings taught Tom to dig a fistful of earth and crumble it in his palm, explaining by feel and smell whether rain was needed or if roots below were thriving. He'd point out sparrow burrows and worm castings, showing Tom how life below the surface could predict what grew above. You want to understand a field, you gotta look at what nobody else bothers to, he would say, handing over a magnifying glass and a battered book on beneficial bugs. Inspired by these memories, Tom began quietly testing what he'd learned. He poked shallow holes in drier earth to watch if ants found them, placed pebbles near wilted beans to see which spots cooled at dusk. He taped a bit of cloth over a warm patch and noted whether dew collected there. Little by little, the wasted hours became a pattern of experiments, a secret language of dirt, bugs, and roots. Even as the field withered, he clung to these methods, hoping he'd find something the others had missed, and that Mr. Hastings' quiet wisdom would not be wasted. Convinced he'd found clues, Tom finally spoke up at the dinner table, suggesting they shift irrigation to where the dew lingered longer, or try planting along the faint, cooler lines he'd mapped. His father barely looked up from his plate, too tired and set in his ways to debate child's logic. His brother laughed outright, dismissing Tom's observation as another excuse to avoid hauling buckets. The next day, someone from school called him the field napper, and a group of kids mimed sleeping in the crops till even Tom felt the sting. He tried again to help with chores, but hands that sought patterns found little comfort in routine work. Feeling that his patience had run its course, Tom retreated further, curling under the tree each afternoon, still jotting notes, but with less hope. The gap between what he saw and what the world respected growing wider by the day. Even his old notebook seemed heavier in his hands, filled with answers no one wanted. When August's worst heat wave rolled in, Marsh Hollow felt like it had been set aflame. Ponds shrank to mud, the cornfields rattled in hot wind, and the miller's lowest rows looked doomed. But as Tom lay under his old tree one blazing afternoon, he noticed the ants never left a winding stretch of beans, even as the ground around turned bone dry. He pressed his palm to the earth, and, in the middle of all that sun-burned dust, felt a faint, lingering coolness. Flipping through old notebook pages, he matched the cool soil's path with every dew-soaked spot from early mornings and every cluster of wildflowers that clung to green. That evening, Tom waited until shadows stretched long and quietly dug into the cracked field where his clues pointed. To his shock, a trickle of fresh, clear water seeped from deeper down, feeding the roots below. With urgency, he ran to fetch his father, guiding him to the spot. They shifted irrigation pipes to catch every drop from this hidden spring, focusing rescue efforts on the weakest rows. Within days, new shoots punched through the dust. By week's end, green tide crept across the field, and neighbors whispered about the miracle patch. Tom, once the lazy dreamer, watered the field in quiet satisfaction, his patient notes finally saving what work alone could not. As word spread about the green patch, folks from all over Marsh Hollow came to see for themselves. Neighbors who had shaken their heads at Tom all summer stood in his family's field, marveling at sturdy bean plants and thick vines thriving in the middle of drought-scorched rows. Some discovered Tom's battered notebook, filled to the corners with notes on dew, root patterns, and insect trails, and passed it from hand to hand with a new respect. His father, once convinced Tom was just avoiding chores, flipped through the pages in stunned silence, his brow furrowed not with worry, but with awe. Aunts and uncles invited Tom to explain what he'd seen and done. Even classmates who'd once teased him sat cross-legged in the field, listening as Tom spoke for the first time about what he'd learned by lying so still. People started asking when he'd noticed the spring, and if he thought the pattern would appear next year. The lazy boy's patience, long mistaken for idleness, now stood out as the rare kind of wisdom that quietly pulled a whole community through hard times. The harvest came, smaller than some years but sweeter, a field saved by quiet hope. When the fields finally turned gold and the last crates rolled into town, Marsh Hollow was left to reconsider what had really saved the Miller crop. For years, they'd prized sweat and speed above everything, never pausing to watch, or to trust that someone lying still might see what others missed. Tom's story reminded even the oldest farmers that a harvest depends not just on muscle, but on patience, empathy, and the simple courage to observe when everyone else rushes by. Sometimes, what looks like laziness is deep attention. Sometimes quiet kids hold answers past generations forgot to look for. In a season when the land was crying for help, Tom's refusal to stop noticing the small things, soil shifts, dew, and the hidden movement of life, became the difference between loss and survival. His calm, so often misunderstood, helped the community see that every farm and every family needs both strong hands and watchful hearts if they want to keep growing through whatever storms may come. Have you ever been doubted for doing something different, or felt misunderstood because you saw the world a little differently? Maybe a quiet habit or old family lesson made a difference no one else expected. Share your story in the comments, whether it's a time you paid attention when others rushed past, or a moment when quiet observation saved the day in your family, farm, or hometown. Tell us where you're watching from, and help build a space where every kind of attention, patience, and hidden wisdom is celebrated and shared.